She dismissed him in front of 11 board members, 2 investors, and a floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the gray sprawl of downtown Halifax. Carolyn Marsh gave a quiet nod to her head of security, and the man was walked out of the Aldercroft Hotel's executive suite the way you'd walk out someone who'd wandered in from the street. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He was carrying a paper cup from the Tim Hortons in the lobby, the small one, the one that cost $2, and he smiled slightly when the security guard touched his arm, which should have been the first sign that something was very wrong with how this morning was going. It wasn't. 41 minutes later, her phone rang. The deal was gone, and the man they'd just walked out the door was the one who'd had it. The morning had started the way dangerous mornings usually did, quietly, looking like nothing important. Carolyn Marsh had been awake since 4:52, which wasn't unusual. She lay in the dark of her suite on the 14th floor and listened to the Atlantic wind push itself against the glass and thought about the number she'd been living inside for the past 8 weeks. $62 million. Not a number she could say casually anymore. It had stopped feeling like money and started feeling like weather, something you couldn't ignore, couldn't outrun, just had to move through. She'd taken the chair at Aldercroft Hospitality 3 years ago, at 31, 6 months after her mother's cardiac event had made continuing impossible, and someone had to step forward. The company was a mid-sized chain of boutique hotels across Atlantic Canada, Halifax, Fredericton, Charlottetown, a newer property in Moncton that had never quite found its footing. Her father had built it over 27 years. It was not glamorous, and it was not small, and the people who worked inside it had been there long enough that they knew each other's children's names. The McNeil Capital Partnership was supposed to secure the next decade of it. She'd spent 6 weeks preparing. Her VP of Finance, a careful man named Douglas who had the useful quality of never sugarcoating anything, had laid it plainly in September. Without significant capital by the end of Q1, Aldercroft would spend the following 2 years in a slow and increasingly public contraction. They could probably survive. The word probably in that context had felt like ice shifting. Graham McNeil wasn't a name you found in magazine profiles. He didn't speak at hospitality conferences. He didn't post on LinkedIn. What he had was a 23-year track record that other investors mentioned quietly, the kind of reputation that moved through rooms but never appeared in print. He'd built his capital group from a single fund into something that mid-sized Canadian businesses specifically sought when they were serious about the next phase. He was known, among the people who knew him, for arriving unannounced, for asking questions that seemed peripheral until they weren't, and for walking away from deals that looked perfect on paper if something in the room didn't sit right with him. Carolyn had restructured the pitch twice. She'd reviewed every slide until she could recite the numbers in her sleep. Her chairman, Leonard Foss, had been enthusiastic in the way certain men were enthusiastic when they wanted credit for an outcome they hadn't done the work for. McNeil money changes the conversation. He'd told her over dinner 3 weeks earlier, it legitimizes everything we're trying to build. She'd believed him. She'd believed all of it. She was at the hotel's executive floor by 7:15, which was early enough that the cleaning crew was still in the hallway, and the morning smelled like lemon polish and old carpet. Her assistant, a 26-year-old named Priya, who had been with her since the beginning and who possessed the rare quality of knowing when not to speak, met her outside the boardroom with an iPad and the expression of someone managing 6 things simultaneously. "The AV is sorted," Priya said. "Catering is set up. There's a projector issue on the secondary screen that's being handled, and Mr. Foss called to say he's running behind. Of course he is. Also, the fruit platter. They sent the wrong kind. What kind did they send?" "Melon heavy. You asked for berries." Carolyn set down her bag. "Fix it." She spent the next 20 minutes at the table going through the presentation one final time. Not because she needed to, she knew it. It was more that the doing of something felt better than sitting with what was living underneath. Her mother used to say that preparation was just anxiety with somewhere to put itself. She wasn't sure she agreed, but she kept the phrase around anyway. By 9:40, she was in the boardroom. Floor-to-ceiling windows on 3 sides, a table that seated 16, a view of the harbor that on clear days was genuinely extraordinary. Today was a clear day, the brittle November kind, the water below catching the light in a way that looked almost apologetic given how the morning was about to go. Leonard arrived at 9:53, unhurried in the manner of a man who had decided long ago that his time was the variable other people arranged around. He made his rounds, shook hands, made a joke about the drive from Dartmouth, and settled at the far end of the table from Carolyn, which she had always felt was a positioning choice, not a preference. McNeil Capital's representative was expected at 10 o'clock. At 9:58, the boardroom door opened. Carolyn was going over a point with Douglas when it happened, that slight atmospheric shift a room makes when someone unexpected enters. She turned to see a man she didn't recognize standing near the door. He was perhaps mid-40s, not particularly tall. Wearing a plain charcoal jacket, no tie, dark jeans that were clean but not pressed. He was holding a paper Tim Hortons cup, the small one. He was looking out the window at the harbor with the expression of someone who found it genuinely interesting. One of the junior associates, a 23-year-old named Kyle who had been assigned to coordinate guest arrivals and was taking this responsibility with notable seriousness, appeared at the man's elbow. "Can I help you, sir?" The man turned. He had a calm face, unhurried eyes, the look of someone who had heard a question like this before and found it neither surprising nor offensive. "I'm good," he said. "Thanks. This is a closed meeting," Kyle said. "I'm aware." Kyle straightened. "I'm going to need to see a confirmation or a badge before, Kyle." Carolyn had crossed the room. She needed the meeting to start. She didn't need this. She looked at the man and felt something she couldn't quite name, the strange near recognition of a face you've seen somewhere but can't place. "I'm sorry. Who are you here with?" The man looked at her. His expression didn't change. "I'm here for the 10 o'clock, he said. She glanced back at the table. McNeil Capital had confirmed 2 attendees, a senior associate named Janet Lowe and the principal himself, Graham McNeil. She looked at the man in the charcoal jacket with the Tim Hortons cup. She should have asked his name. She knew that, not later, not in the bathroom with cold water on her wrists. She knew it in the moment, somewhere underneath the clock on the wall, and Douglas trying to get her attention and the projector still being adjusted. She knew it, and she moved past it. "I'm sorry," she said, and she heard herself use the efficient voice, the one that kept things moving. "If you're with the McNeil team, we'll need a confirmation before we can have you in the room. If you'd like to wait in reception, someone can. He's already been cleared." A woman's voice from the doorway. Janet Lowe had arrived. Late 30s, sharp blazer, carrying a leather folio and wearing the expression of someone watching something go wrong that she'd been hoping wouldn't. She was looking at the man in the charcoal jacket. "He's cleared," Janet said again, quieter this time, controlled. "If he's cleared," Kyle started. Then, Kyle. Leonard, from the far end of the table, not looking up from his phone. "Handle it." And Kyle handled it the way a 23-year-old told to handle something handles it, with total commitment and no curiosity about whether the commitment was correctly directed. He touched the man's arm. "Sir, I'll have to ask you to wait in reception until your credentials can be." Carolyn had already turned away. She was looking at the clock. It said 9:59. Douglas was speaking. She turned back toward the table. She heard the door open. She heard it close. She looked at Janet Lowe, who was standing very still in the way people stood still when they were deciding whether to say what they were actually thinking. "Mrs. Lowe," Carolyn said, "welcome. We're ready when you are." Janet looked at her for a moment. Then she sat down, put her folio on the table, and didn't say another word. The meeting ran 40 minutes. Carolyn presented the way she always presented, cleanly, confidently, with the easy precision of someone who had done this enough times that the professionalism was structural and not performed. She walked through the numbers. She answered Janet's 2 questions with specificity and care. She was good. She knew she was good. Graham McNeil's chair sat at the corner of the table and didn't move. No one mentioned it directly. At 10:37, her phone buzzed under the table. She ignored it. At 10:40, it buzzed again. At 10:42, Priya opened the boardroom door and caught her eye with a look that meant now, not after. Carolyn wrapped up with 2 minutes of prepared closing remarks and called a short break. She was in the hallway before the door finished closing. Priya held out her phone without speaking. The email was from Graham McNeil's office. 4 sentences. McNeil Capital was withdrawing from all discussions regarding a potential investment in Aldercroft Hospitality, effective immediately. The decision was final and not subject to renegotiation. Further inquiries should be directed to their legal team. The 4th sentence read, "We wish Aldercroft Hospitality continued success." She read it twice. She was aware of her own breathing. "When did this come in?" she said. 10:31, Priya said. 11 minutes ago. 11 minutes after the door had closed on a man in a charcoal jacket carrying a paper coffee cup. "Priya," Carolyn said. "Yeah, what does Graham McNeil look like?" Priya looked at her. A beat. Then she pulled up a profile on her phone, plain background, a photograph that was almost aggressively unremarkable, and handed it over. Carolyn looked at the photograph. The photograph looked back. She handed the phone to Priya. She stood in the corridor outside a room full of people waiting for her, and the harbor was gray-bright through the window at the end of the hall, and she said nothing for a long moment. "I need 5 minutes," she said. "You have 3, said Priya. After that, they'll start wondering. She went to the women's bathroom at the end of the corridor and ran cold water over her wrists, something her mother had taught her when she was 14 and had panic attacks before swim meets. The cold brings you back to your body when your mind is trying to leave the building. She stood at the sink and looked at herself in the mirror. She had restructured the pitch twice. She had driven the wrong water away and ordered the right water. She had reviewed every number until they lived in her sleep. And she had turned away from a man standing near a window with a Tim Hortons cup without asking his name. The face in the mirror didn't have much comfort to offer. She dried her hands. She went back into the boardroom and thanked everyone for their time, told them there would be follow-up from her office, and kept her voice even throughout. After the room cleared, she sat at the empty table for 7 minutes. Leonard came back in eventually. She hadn't heard him enter. "What happened?" he said. "We lost it." He made a sound of concern that was very convincing. "How? The presentation was excellent. The presentation was fine. Then what went wrong?" She looked at him. "I need to think," she said. He patted the table twice. "We'll find another way," he said. "This isn't over." He left. She looked at Graham McNeil's empty chair, still slightly angled from the table, where someone had pulled it out and never sat down. She didn't know yet why the words "we'll find another way" made the back of her neck feel cold. She started digging the next morning. She'd always been good at research. Her father had built that into her, the conviction that information was the only thing that didn't depreciate, that before you moved, you understood the ground. She pulled everything available on Graham McNeil herself rather than assigning it. She didn't want this traveling through the building yet. What she found surprised her in both directions. Graham McNeil had started his fund at 29 with a small pool of investors who'd believed in him for reasons the public record didn't entirely explain. 15 years later, it was one of the most consistently performing mid-size investment firms in the country. Not the most prominent, not the one that appeared in profiles. The one that, when people who'd actually worked with him talked about it, they talked quietly, with a particular tone reserved for things that had proved themselves. He was 44. He had a daughter named Wren. The articles that mentioned her were limited. One profile in a Halifax business quarterly agreed to apparently because a portion of the proceeds had gone to a literacy program in Dartmouth. The writer noted that he had declined to be photographed for 3 months before agreeing, and then only from a distance. There was a quote near the end of the piece that she read twice. "I've never been interested in being seen as someone important. I'm interested in making correct decisions. Those two things get confused for each other constantly, and most of what goes wrong in business comes from that confusion." She put the piece down. She went to the window of her office and stood with her arms crossed, looking at the water, and she thought about a man who had walked into her boardroom alone with a paper coffee cup and allowed himself to be walked back out. He had expected exactly what he got. The question she was beginning to turn over was whether the test was finished. She called Janet Lowe that afternoon. It rang 4 times. She left a message, composed, professional, no urgency in her voice, saying she hoped they could speak before the end of the week, and that she'd appreciate understanding if there was anything specific that had influenced the decision. She genuinely wanted to understand. Janet called back in 9 minutes. "Miss Marsh," she said. That was her opening. "Thank you for calling," Carolyn said. "I almost didn't." A pause. "What happened yesterday was embarrassing, not for Mr. McNeil, for your organization. I understand that, do you?" Janet's voice wasn't unkind, precisely. It was the voice of someone who meant what they said, and wasn't particularly interested in softening the landing. "Because from where I was sitting, the CEO of a company asking for $62 million didn't recognize who she was meeting with, and when given several seconds to correct that, chose not to." Carolyn breathed. "That's accurate," she said. "I failed to identify him. I let a junior staff member manage the situation when I should have managed it myself. That was a mistake." A longer pause. "He walked in with the Tim Hortons cup on purpose," Janet said finally. Carolyn processed that. "I assumed. He does it for every first meeting. No announcement, no advance introduction from his side. He wants to see what a room does with someone who doesn't look like $62 million. A pause. "Most rooms fail. Did we fail worse than most?" Janet was quiet for a moment. "Your junior associate was doing his job. He can't be blamed. The others followed his lead. That's a reflection of your culture, not their individual choices." She paused again. "What he saw was you, not Kyle. You. He was watching what you would do, and you were already looking somewhere else." Carolyn stood very still. Outside the window, a gull landed on the edge of the hotel's upper terrace and walked in one direction and flew away. "Is there anything I can do?" she said. "I don't know. He doesn't reopen things as a rule." A pause. The But this morning he asked me one question." Carolyn waited. "He asked whether you made the follow-up call yourself or had your assistant do it." Carolyn looked down at her own name on the screen. "Outgoing. I called. I know," Janet said. "I told him." 3 days later, Douglas came to her office at 4 in the afternoon and closed the door. He only closed the door when the news was the kind that shouldn't travel through glass. "I've been going through the Halcyon numbers," he said. Halcyon Investment Partners had contacted Aldercroft the morning after McNeil Capital withdrew. She had noted the timing at the time and filed it under unfortunate coincidence. She was beginning to reconsider the filing system. Douglas put a single sheet of paper on her desk covered in his handwriting, small and exact. Halcyon's primary backer, through 2 shell companies, traced to a holdings group called Meridian Shore Advisory. Meridian Shore Advisory had been incorporated 22 months ago. Its registered agent was a law firm that represented, among other clients, Leonard Foss. She looked at the paper for a long time. "How sure are you?" she said. 14 hours, Douglas said. "I'm sure." She nodded slowly. The room felt very still. Leonard had pushed her toward McNeil. Leonard had been enthusiastic. McNeil money legitimizes everything. And when the deal collapsed, Leonard had come back into the boardroom and sat across from her, with his hands pressed together on the table, the gesture of a man visibly performing thoughtfulness, and said, "We'll find another way." He'd already had the other way arranged. She looked at Douglas. He looked back. They had worked together for 2.5 years. He was 53 years old, and he had the face, right now, of someone who had already done most of the feeling they needed to do about this, and had arrived at something quieter and harder on the other side of it. "Don't tell anyone," she said. "Already haven't. I need to think," she thought all night. By 6 in the morning, she was at the coffee shop 2 blocks from the hotel, a small place called Founders, scuffed floors and mismatched chairs, and a counter where a woman named Bet made coffee without asking, because Carolyn had been coming in long enough that the order was assumed. She was sitting at the window table with her second cup and a legal pad full of handwriting when the door opened and a child walked in. The girl was perhaps 9, dark braids escaping from a clip. She was wearing a heavy coat and carrying a sketchbook tucked against her chest, the way you carried something you were responsible for. She came in, looked around the room with the frank critical eye of a child who had opinions about spaces, and then walked to a table near the back, sat down, opened the sketchbook, and began drawing without any preamble. Carolyn watched her for a moment. Then she went back to her legal pad. 2 minutes later, the door opened again. She knew before she looked. She wasn't sure how. Maybe it was pattern recognition. Maybe it was 3 days of assembling a picture of a person from fragments, and the picture had become complete enough that she recognized the original when it walked through the door. Graham McNeil came in holding a Tim Hortons cup, the large one this time, from the hotel lobby, and crossed to the table where the child was sitting. He said something low that made the girl look up briefly, then look back down. He sat across from her and opened a laptop. He didn't look toward the window. Carolyn looked at her legal pad. She looked at it for approximately 90 seconds, which was 75 seconds longer than it took her to decide. She got up. She crossed the room. She stood at their table until he looked up, not long, 4 seconds, and when he did, his expression was the one she recognized. Unhurried, attentive, neither warm nor unkind. "I owe you an apology," she said. She hadn't planned the phrasing. Not a professional one, a real one. "What happened in that room was wrong because I wasn't paying attention to the right things. That was my failure, not my staff's." Something moved in his face. Not surprise exactly. Something more considered than surprise. "Sit down," he said. She sat down. The girl had not looked up, but her pencil had slowed. Carolyn noticed. "This is Wren," Graham said. He said the name the way people said names of things they took seriously. "Hi, Wren," Carolyn said. Wren didn't respond immediately, but after a moment she tilted the sketchbook slightly, just a few degrees, a fraction of an offering. On the page was the coffee shop, the counter, Bet behind it, the regulars at their tables, the window with the street outside. It was detailed in a way that seemed impossible for 9 years old. Every chair leg was in the right place. "She draws everything," Graham said, not explaining it apologetically, stating it. Carolyn looked at the page and then at the girl and said nothing, because sometimes the right response was not a response at all. She looked at Graham. "I know what my company needs," she said, "and I'm not here to pitch you. I want to be clear about that." She paused. "I think something is wrong inside my organization, something larger than a bad meeting. I'm working to understand it fully before I do something I can't undo." He watched her. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you've already walked away," she said. "You have no reason to be involved, which means if you tell me what you know, there's no angle to it." The coffee shop noise moved around them. The espresso machine. A chair scraping. Bet calling out an order. Leonard Foss, Graham said. The name landed. He contacted us, Graham said, indirectly through an intermediary approximately 3 weeks before your presentation. He communicated that the deal would include a side advisory arrangement for a consulting group connected to him, and he represented this as consistent with how your company structured its partnerships. A pause. When I arrived that morning, I wasn't only evaluating the pitch. Carolyn was very still. And then you were walked to reception, she said. Not with any satisfaction, he said. Just what happened. I understand. She paused. I don't think you do entirely. He leaned forward slightly, the first shift in his posture she'd seen. What Foss communicated to us, if it's accurate, means the deal was never going to close on the terms you presented. He intended to engineer a renegotiation that served him, not your company. Carolyn looked at the table, then at him. Can you prove it? I can tell you what I know, he said. What you do with it is your business. I mean that precisely. It has to be yours. She understood the line he was drawing. She understood it was the right line. Thank you, she said. He nodded once. Wren looked up then. She turned the sketchbook so it faced Carolyn. She had added 2 new figures to the coffee shop drawing, at the window table where Carolyn had been sitting, and now at this table too. Both figures small and careful, facing each other over cups. Is that us? Carolyn said. Wren considered the drawing with the critical detachment she brought to everything. You both have the same face, she said. What face? The thinking one, Wren said, and went back to drawing. Graham made a sound that was almost a laugh. He turned it into clearing his throat, but not entirely successfully. Carolyn looked at the 2 small figures on the page and felt something shift in the morning that wasn't the crisis. The crisis was still there, patient and heavy, but something underneath it, running in a different direction. She stood. She picked up her legal pad. I have a lot of work to do, she said. I know, he said. She walked to the door and out into the November cold, which was sharp and full and completely indifferent to the fact that her company was sitting on something that had to be handled before it became something she couldn't handle. She started walking. She walked 9 blocks before her pace slowed, not from tiredness, but because her brain worked through motion, had always worked through motion, and by the time she turned back toward the hotel, she had a list she wasn't writing down. What she had, Douglas's documentation, Graham's account of the intermediary approach, the timeline, Leonard pushing McNeil, the deal collapsing, Halcyon appearing the very next morning like something that had been waiting in a lobby. What she needed, the connection between Leonard and Halcyon that existed on paper in a form that would survive a board vote and couldn't be dismantled by a lawyer in 20 minutes. What she didn't have, time to be wrong. She found the connection on Thursday, the way these things were sometimes found, through a footnote. Leonard had disclosed a financial services relationship with a firm called Whitmore Group in his original conflict of interest filing 7 years ago. No one had looked twice at it because it hadn't been relevant 7 years ago. Whitmore Group was listed as a co-administrator for the Halcyon Investment Partners Fund. The administrative overlap was narrow, but it was documented. It was a thread. Douglas believed that if you pulled it, there was more attached. She also authorized her head of IT security, a methodical man named Gerald, to pull the internal access logs for the company's financial forecasting system. What Gerald found, presented to her the following morning with the careful neutrality of someone who had been sitting on this information longer than he'd known what to do with it, was that someone had been extracting documents from that system at careful intervals over the past 7 months. The credentials belonged to a third-party consultant retained by the board 19 months ago. The consultant's engagement had been approved and championed by the chairman. She called the company's external counsel, a woman named Patricia Clark, that same afternoon. Patricia had 22 years of corporate litigation behind her, and the specific manner of someone who had seen every variety of institutional bad behavior and had never once been surprised by it. Carolyn gave her 3 sentences and asked for a call. Patricia picked up on the second ring. I was expecting to hear from you, Patricia said. Were you? When a CEO sends me 3 sentences and asks for a same-day call, I know what kind of afternoon it's going to be. A pause. Talk. Carolyn talked for 12 minutes. Patricia listened without interrupting. How solid is the financial documentation? Patricia said when she finished. My CFO built it. And the account from the outside investor, the intermediary approach? Firsthand. Nothing written. Written would be better. A pause. Can you get it? Carolyn thought about Graham. About the line he'd drawn and how clearly he'd drawn it. I don't know, she said. Here's what I need you to do, Patricia said. Don't confront Foss. Don't let him know you're looking. Don't move the financial records, but have your CFO keep documented copies held separately. Get me everything by end of business Friday. A pause. If what you're describing is accurate, this is a breach of fiduciary duty at minimum, possibly securities fraud, depending on what the halcyon connection looks like in writing. The phrase securities fraud sat in the air. One more thing, Patricia said. Who knows about this? My CFO. Me. The outside investor, though not the details of what I've found. Keep it that way. Every person you tell is a variable you can't manage. After she hung up, Carolyn sat at her desk for 10 minutes. She thought about what Graham had said in the coffee shop. It has to be your business, not a warning, a condition. He'd wanted her to carry it to the point where it was genuinely hers, built by her hands, owned by her, before she asked anything of anyone else. She thought she might have reached that point. She pulled up the number Janet Lowe had called from and typed a text. She said she needed 15 minutes if he was willing, that she wasn't asking about the deal, that she would explain when they spoke. She put the phone down. She told herself not to watch it. She watched it for 90 seconds before it buzzed. Graham's reply was 5 words. Tomorrow. Same place. 8 o'clock. She exhaled. The weekend was the particular kind of waiting that moved too fast and too slow at once. She spent Saturday not at the office. A deliberate choice, because she knew herself well enough to know she would keep pulling threads she'd already pulled as far as they went, and that over-preparing for the thing you were afraid of was its own kind of avoidance. She reorganized the kitchen in her apartment instead. She rearranged the cupboard with the mugs 3 times. She ate dinner at the table, which was notable because she had eaten standing at the counter for the better part of 2 months. She called her father, who was in Victoria with his sister and who had handed her the chair 3 years ago and had never once suggested she wasn't ready for it, which was either faith or deliberate kindness, and she had decided long ago to treat it as both. "How's the week been?" he said. "Long," she said. "Good, I think. I'll know more next week. You always say that. It's usually true." He laughed, which was a good sound. She stayed on the call longer than she meant to. Sunday, she reviewed her notes. Just the notes. She'd internalized the documents. Going back to them now would be anxiety dressed up as diligence. She walked herself through the boardroom the way she used to walk through a difficult presentation before delivering it. Not rehearsing, exactly. Just standing in the space in her mind and getting used to it. She knew where Leonard would sit. She knew what he would do when she started laying it out. He would interrupt. He would reframe. He would use 7 years of warmth in that room like a tool, and he would aim it at the other board members and try to make this about her state of mind, her inexperience, her grief over her father's absence from the company. He would be very good at it. He'd had practice. She ran every version of that scenario. She was not going to let him reframe it. She went to bed at 10 and slept better than she had in weeks, which surprised her every time it happened. The night before the hardest thing was often the best sleep. Like the body, having given up on postponing, simply let go. She was in the building by 7 Monday morning. Priya arrived at 7:20 and stopped in the doorway. "Today's the day," Priya said. It wasn't a question. Today's the day. Priya came in and closed the door. She stood across the desk and looked at Carolyn directly. "You want me in the room? I need you outside it." Priya understood what that meant without requiring an explanation. Outside the room meant knowing everything in real time. Meant controlling what moved and where. Meant appearing completely ordinary to anyone who walked past. The emergency board meeting was called for 10 o'clock. Carolyn had submitted the formal request Sunday evening through legal, citing the emergency provision, listing Douglas and Patricia as supporting witnesses. Confirmations came in through the evening. Leonard's came at 10:47, almost an hour after the others, which told her he had spent the intervening time deciding whether appearing was better or worse than the alternative. He decided that absence told its own story. At 9:58, Carolyn took the elevator to the executive floor alone. She stood in the boardroom before anyone else arrived and looked at the harbor through the 3 windows and thought about nothing specific. She was past the thinking stage. The thinking stage was done. Now was the doing stage, which required a different part of herself entirely, the part that went quiet and moved forward. She set her documents at the head of the table. The room filled over the next 10 minutes. 4 board members, 2 independent directors, the company's general counsel, and a representative from the audit committee. Leonard arrived at 10:02. Charcoal blazer, easy smile, the practiced warmth moving through the room ahead of him like something he'd arranged in advance. He looked at Carolyn, sitting at the head of the table, and something crossed his face quickly, a recalibration, and then the smile came back. "Carolyn," he said, "unusual format for a Monday." "Thank you for making the time, Leonard." He settled in. He looked at Patricia. He looked at Douglas. He looked at the bound documents in front of Carolyn. His eyes moved across all of it with the narrowed attention of a man who'd read enough rooms to recognize when one had been arranged against him. He decided to look relaxed. She began. She did it the way Patricia had outlined, the timeline first, the pattern before the name. She walked the board through the access logs with the precision of someone who had memorized every date and every file. She explained the consultant account, the credentials, the systematic extraction over 7 months. She watched the faces around the table, the audit committee representative's expression tightening, one of the independent directors leaning forward, the general counsel going very still in the way lawyers went still when they understood what they were looking at. She did not look at Leonard, not yet. She presented the advisory contracts. She walked through a potential acquisition from 18 months ago, a small hospitality group in Cape Breton that had been killed on Leonard's recommendation when the financial case for it was sound, that had been acquired 8 months later by a firm with a co-investment arrangement tracing back to Leonard's financial network. She laid it out without adjectives. She let the timeline speak. She heard Leonard shift in his chair. She presented the Halcyon connection, the shell companies, the Meridian Shore Advisory Link, the Whitmore Group overlap. She watched the general counsel write something on his pad. "I'd like to pause here," Leonard said. His voice was smooth, controlled. "I think there's significant context being omitted, and I'd like to address." Under the emergency disclosure provision, Section 12, Clause 2 of the company's governance bylaws, Carolyn said without raising her voice, "an integrity disclosure by a sitting CEO may not be interrupted by motion until the disclosure is complete. I'd ask you to hold your response until I've finished." She looked at him directly. "Thank you, Leonard." The room went very quiet. She held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then she looked back at her documents and continued. She presented the account from the outside investor last. She introduced it as a written statement from an external principal, obtained voluntarily, documenting an intermediary approach made to McNeil Capital approximately 3 weeks before the partnership presentation. She did not use Graham's name. The document was attributed to an external investment principal, sufficient for the board's purposes and consistent with the boundary he'd drawn. She read 3 excerpts. The first identified the intermediary by name and described the approach. The second detailed what had been communicated about the proposed advisory arrangement and who had been represented as authorizing it. The third documented the date and the specific terms that had never appeared in any version of the deal structure Carolyn had prepared or approved. She set the document down. She looked up at the room. The audit committee representative was looking at Leonard, so were both independent directors. The general counsel had stopped writing. Leonard looked at Carolyn. She recognized it in real time. The look Patricia had described, the slight forward lean, the expression calibrating towards something that wanted to read as wounded and reasonable. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her across tables for 3 years, collegially, warmly, the look of someone who was on your side. She could see through it now, clearly and completely. She looked back at him and did not look away. "These are serious allegations," Leonard said. His voice had lost something at the edges, not much, just a fraction, "and I want to be clear that I take them seriously. But what we have here is circumstantial, and we have a CEO who is understandably under pressure following a significant lost deal, presenting a David," Carolyn said, not looking away from Leonard, addressing the general counsel. "Would you read the fiduciary responsibility provision from Section 9? David read it. It was 10 words with very little room for interpretation. "A documented pattern of conduct over 19 months, Carolyn said, with verified evidence of financial benefit to a connected party, satisfies the threshold for an emergency review under that provision." She looked away from Leonard and addressed the full table. "I'm not asking this board to make a finding today. I'm asking you to authorize an independent audit of every transaction, advisory contract, and deal recommendation involving the chairman over the past 3 years. And I'm moving, under the emergency provision, that Leonard Foss recuse himself from all board activities pending the outcome of that audit." Silence. The kind that had weight. Leonard put both hands flat on the table. "I've given 6 years to this company," he said. 6 years. "And I think the people in this room know my commitment to. I think we've heard the disclosure." This from the board's senior independent director, a 61-year-old woman named Harriet, who had been on the board since before Carolyn had taken the chair. She rarely spoke at length, but when she did, the room rearranged around her. She was looking at Leonard with an expression that was not hostile, precisely, but had lost entirely the warmth with which she'd always regarded him. "I think we should vote." Leonard looked at Harriet. Harriet looked back. Something collapsed in his face. Not dramatically, not the way it happened in stories. More like watching something structural develop a quiet crack. The thing still standing, still trying to look like it was load-bearing, but the weight sitting differently now. The vote took 6 minutes. The motion to authorize an independent audit passed 5-1. The motion for Leonard's recusal pending the audit passed 5-1. The single vote against both motions was Leonard's own. He cast it looking at the table, his jaw set, the warmth entirely gone from his face, replaced by something harder and smaller than what he'd used for the room. He stood. He straightened his jacket. He looked at Carolyn. "You're making a mistake," he said, quietly. The voice under the voice, which she'd never heard before, and which was less impressive than the one he used in rooms. "I don't think I am," she said. He left. The door closed. She stood at the head of the table and felt the room reconfigure around his absence. Board members who had been holding themselves rigid were shifting now, releasing something. Harriet caught Carolyn's eye from across the table and gave her one slow nod, the kind that meant more than a sentence would. Carolyn nodded back. She stood at the head of the table until the room had mostly cleared. Then she sat down and put both hands flat on the surface and breathed. Her knees were doing something she didn't want displayed while people were still walking past. Patricia sat back down across from her. "You held the room," Patricia said. "I held the room," Carolyn said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. After Patricia left, Douglas stayed. He sat across from her with the look she'd come to think of as his post-crisis face, a little emptied out, a little more tired than he'd been an hour ago. "It's going to go public," he said. "Probably Wednesday. I know. The employees hear from me first. Before press, before anyone else. The people in this building need to hear it in my words before they read it somewhere else." Douglas nodded. He gathered his papers. At the door he stopped. "Your father would have handled it the same way," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it." He left. She sat in the empty boardroom for a long time. She looked at Leonard's chair, pushed back from the table at the angle a person left when they stood in a hurry. She looked at the harbor through the 3 windows. The November light was doing its low-angle thing, cutting a long stripe across the table. She reached into her bag and found her phone and typed a text to Graham. She kept it short. "Board voted. Audit authorized. He's recused." She looked at it for a second and then added, "I held the room." She set the phone down. She looked at the harbor. The phone buzzed. She picked it up. 3 words from Graham. "I know you did." She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at the boardroom one last time, the light on the table, the empty chairs, the water outside, already moving on in the way that bodies of water moved on, indifferent and continuous and somehow exactly right. She had a company to run. She picked up her bag and walked out. That was the beginning of the work that actually mattered. Not the case, not the vote, but the long, unglamorous process of rebuilding something that had been compromised from the inside for longer than she'd known. The audit ran 6 weeks and found what she had expected, and some things she hadn't. Leonard Foss had been redirecting company resources, deal flow, and confidential strategic information for the benefit of connected parties for 4 years, not 2. The Cape Breton acquisition she'd flagged was one of 3 such instances. The excess advisory payments totaled just under $1.5 million. He hadn't exploited the transition period when she'd taken over. He'd been doing this before the transition, and the transition had simply given him better cover. She sat with that number, 4 years, for a long time before it became something she could work with, rather than something she just had to hold. She rebuilt the board. She rewrote the conflict of interest disclosure process herself, with Douglas and Patricia reviewing the draft. She changed the access controls on the financial system and sat in on Gerald's training sessions for the new protocol, which surprised him in a way she found useful, the surprised expression of someone who'd been waiting to be taken seriously. She stayed late on some nights, but not all nights. She called her father twice a week. She ate dinner at the table more often than not. And in the second week of December, she was at Founders for her morning coffee when the door opened and Graham came in. Alone this time, Wren presumably in school, and saw her at the window table and crossed to it without particular ceremony, the way people moved toward things they'd decided about already. He sat across from her. "The audit closed," she said. "I heard." He wrapped both hands around his cup. 4 years. 4 years. How are you doing with it?" She thought about how to answer honestly. "Better than I expected," she said. "Worse than I'm performing." Something in his expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but in its neighborhood. "I've been thinking," she said, "about a proposal. Not the one from October. That one was built inside a poisoned context and it doesn't represent what the company actually is. I want to rebuild it from scratch." She looked at him. The fundamentals were always solid. "The partnership structure, done correctly, is still worth doing. I want to bring it to you properly when it's ready. 4 to 6 weeks. He looked at her steadily. "I'll be ready when you are," he said. She picked up her coffee. He picked up his. Outside, the December street was doing its pre-holiday thing, the particular sidewalk energy of a city getting ready for something, moving with slightly more purpose than usual. "Wren wants to know when you're coming for dinner," Graham said. Carolyn looked at him. "Wren told you to tell me that. Wren told me to ask you, but she also told me what to say if you seemed uncertain. What were you supposed to say? That she started a new drawing and there's a seat saved for you in it." Carolyn looked at her coffee. She thought about a sketchbook tilted toward her in a coffee shop. Two small, careful figures at a table, the thinking face. "Tell her Thursday," she said. "If that works." He looked at her with the quality of attention she had first seen across a ruined boardroom 4 months ago and had been learning to recognize since. The kind that saw more than it announced, that had no performance in it, that was simply, completely there. "Thursday works," he said. She nodded. Outside, the December light was doing the thing it did at this latitude in this season, coming in low and pale, and somehow making everything look more itself than usual, the buildings and the water and the street below. She looked at it through the window and felt underneath the audit and the rebuilt board and the 4 years and everything still unfinished, something that was quiet and specific and not dramatic at all, which was maybe how you knew it was real. She had a proposal to finish building and a company to protect and a dinner on Thursday and a seat saved in someone's drawing. She had the work, and she had what had grown around the work. The parts you didn't plan and couldn't engineer and only arrived because you'd stayed in the room when staying was hard. She had, she thought, everything she needed to begin.